welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we'll be talking about how to draw an inchworm. As usual, I'm drawing using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet, and I'm drawing straight into Photoshop. So, let's get arting. Okay, so here is the inchworm. They're pretty cute. It took a little bit trying to sort out how their mouths looked. I have it kind of at this angle, so one of the reasons I drew it this way was, to make sure you could see the rest of the body. Now they don't have fur, so it should be relatively easy to just draw nice long strokes. And they often are this greenish color, and they seem to have a dip in their head, so we're just gonna get started, still layering the lines the way that, actually I'm gonna go back, start that over. I'm gonna use this as the middle point and then twist them out. Still layering the lines the way that, I would with fur, where you have a stroke overlapping with another stroke. And then as I'm coming on this edge, right, I'm sort of following that in, creating a loop inward, right? Like I'm creating this sort of loop inward, and it helps maintain a straight edge. And then we'll do the same on the other side, right? Like I have the middle coming down, and then the edges I'm looping to make that a little easier to do. Now they don't have fur, so we'll be a little bit more careful on the edge, but this is a sketchier style, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And just these nice long strokes following the contour of the head. Now the eyes, at least I think these are eyes, are also green, but they seem to have these little dots in them. I'm almost certain they're eyes. So to indicate the eyes, I'm just going to hump it out differently, right? Like there's just going to be a slightly different angle to it, and then of course leaving the little dots. Give the impression that they seem to bulge a bit there, which is why I think they are eyes. And you can kind of see that. So I'm bringing these lines down all the way to the eye, right, and then past here. Resuming that same contour once we're past, but not running into it, and then bulging it. I have it turned slightly, so this side is turned just that little bit away around all the little black dots. And then keep pulling it down. And then they have these little, their mouth has, these little, I don't know that this is their mouth. They have multiple spots where little, I don't know what to call them, tentacles come off. I don't think they're called tentacles. That animal anatomy getting me again. Right, okay, so this is a place where there could be some line conflict right down in here. So to avoid that, I'm going to loop this down and just have it come over like that. Right, this is under that ridge, so we'll pull that down, pull these down to this point. Now luckily these are all different, tentacles. Again, I don't know what to call them. It should really flesh out nicely with the highlights and shadows. Alright. And then this guy, once again, being mindful of this sort of hoop so that I don't create line conflicts. And then you have this little bulge that sticks out, and then what I think is the mouth. And the highlights and shadows will or should do a good job of helping flesh that out, and we can indicate a recess by, sort of staggering these lines in, but much looser, right? Like, doesn't have to be thick, doesn't have to be a whole lot, just enough that it looks like it's going into a recess, so that it's not a jarring change. And these are rounded, so I'm just going to make sure they look rounded and not pointed. All right. Then they have these different, almost, I don't know, not scales, but different segments of their bodies. And their little feet coming down. And their feet have like they have these little wispy things. It's not a lot, just, almost like little, I don't know if they help them grab or grip or whatever it is, but something. Doing the same thing though on the edge, right? Looping that in to help keep my edge nice and clean, rounded. These do come down a little bit more on a point. They're little grabby legs. At least in the front. In the back they're more rounded. Well, we had highlights and shadows. I'll likely need to do like a burst for each little spot. And then of course the legs on this side. But yep, just that light. Luckily you could do inchworms in multiple colors. That probably would add some interest. I've opted to do it just in green. But they're, for different species of moths, and so there's different variations within inchworms as to how they look. Some people are not, they eat a lot. Unfortunately, they can be pretty devastating to some plants because they just consume so much, but they're pretty cute. I'm just making sure that all of this makes sense. Alright, now the segments should be pretty straightforward. I'm going to separate them, certainly still having those loops. As we come to the middle, we'll come straight down. You can see I'm already straightening out my strokes. So right around here it'll be a straight down. And then off to the side. And we just come right around with it. Same thing, right? Start straight up and down. And then loop it. It should show the segments because we're stopping the lines. And the line directions will actually be different because we're following the contour of each individual segment instead of the inchworm as a whole, which will make the lines, show up differently. So that when I pop that off, you can very clearly see the segments there. And all the way through, right, I'm bringing the lines right down to the edge of the previous one, and then looping at the top. So I am limiting my stroke length now. On the face I was going pretty long. I have to limit it now that I have to be a little bit more careful. But they have like little tiny fur that's sort of sporadically spread out on their body, but not fully covered in fur, right? Like it's all just skin. I don't know if I'm going to add in the little sprinkling of fur or not. Now at the top, which we're about to get to in the very next line, we'll need to be changing these lines because this is one segment. And we'll need to do that without causing any line conflicts. We have this section coming down. And this section coming up. So I'm just looping it, creating a loop. And then the further out it gets from this tighter spot, the looser that loop becomes. Until eventually you won't need it anymore because it'll just be, I mean, you kind of will because you'll be coming off that top, right? Like bringing that line down. Work on that line. Whole thing is gonna have that kind of angle to it. Because you have this section you can see over here. Just bringing it down. Shadows and highlights. Oh yeah, you can see it. Should help flesh that out too. And then these guys, just gonna bring them straight down. Have a little bit of an angle to them. Give the impression that they're these rounded segments. But otherwise, you know, just bringing them straight down. It's also a little easier to angle a stroke when you're running it into something else. You have a little bit more control over where it's ending. If I'm bringing it straight down, sometimes that's a little harder to control. Right, and then you have cute little inchworm here. Especially because their bodies are rounding still, so it makes sense to round it. Now this guy, this little leg kind of bulges. I'm going to have that going in a slightly different direction, and as we bring this in, we'll loop that to connect. Right, so I'm bringing it down, and then I'm turning the stroke to connect it with the lines I'm already doing. Avoid line conflicts. And a little foot here, it's got some ruffling. It's like a very textured little thing. And the rest of these we'll be drawing, you know, in this way, just side to side. Again, looping that in, giving that illusion of roundness. And then their little tail. Same thing. Just looping that in. I'm gonna have the light source coming from above and to the right. Like always, that means above and in front of, not behind or next to. And it's full pin pressure with all of his little things sticking out by his mouth, especially. They'll all get little bursts of highlight. But just gonna start right up here. Full pin pressure. All edges are in shadow, so as we come to the edge of the face, right, this would be in shadow. And that is done just by lessening off my pin pressure. So not as much. And then fading that back in to highlight as it comes out. Nice, good, solid pin pressure. I just need to see where the edge of the head is. Surprisingly, it's actually a little harder for me to judge that with the sketch on. So in shadow, straighten up that line too. It's on an edge. And then pull it back into highlight. Following the lines we've already drawn, right? We've already sorted out where the contour, how the contours are going. And then as we come underneath, that would also have a shadow to it, bigger shadow to it, and on that back side. And then his eye's gonna have some highlights and shadow to it, just a little, just sorting out exactly where the lines are. Just making sure that those lines make sense. And then giving it its own burst, right? Like, it's here, so we'll give it its own little, like, burst. It'll have its edges in shadow. That'll certainly give the illusion that it's bulging. And then we'll have, you know, the highlight here coming up to the edge. We've already put that in shadow, so it's fine. And you can see how that sinks down in just by having that shadow in place. You can see it. I don't want a shadow there. And then if we need to adjust, we can. Because the deeper the shadow, the deeper the bulge, or the deeper a recess, or the deeper you know. So if you want that to be less, it's just a matter of lightening up the shadows. You don't have to put full pen pressure to do that. You can just put more strokes and it'll lighten it up. Still do just enough to leave that it's there, right? Like I can still see it, but temper it off a bit. Now it's there. You can kind of see that it's there, but it's not, you know, as noticeable. Especially on inchworms, it's not as noticeable. Light pin pressure for the edge of the head. Making sure that line is straight as well, as much as I can. Now's the time to do it. With the sketch on, it's hard to do, but now it's easy enough. And then as it comes to this back side, there'll be a deeper shadow, right? Because it's, you know, turning away from the light source. Still, we'll add some highlights and shadowing, and I just have to make sure this edge doesn't have anything that's too extreme of a hook or a bulge or anything anywhere. Nice gentle transition on that line. Now we're kind of coming underneath down here. Sometimes I'll do an edge and shadow because I find it easier to put the shadow in case I get a little over eager with my highlight. Right, so back side of this bulge here will be in shadow. We'll, you know, whenever you're adding shadows and highlights, thinking about the individual shape. There's another little bulge here. So that tip will be in shadow and that edge, but otherwise it'll be in highlight. So we're going to give him a little bit of a burst. It comes down to it. And there'll be some highlighting around it, and I'll help flesh out the fact that it's a something. Something's there. Now there's probably a little bit of a shadow under this. Light source coming from above and to the right, that angle of the light source is going to push the shadow somewhere in this vicinity, which means everything else is highlight. But as it comes under, making sure that's also shadow. Putting that full pin pressure into one of his little things, dupers. Pulling this down, that backside be in shadow. Kind of this bolt going into shadow on its tip and backside, just making sure it's a smooth edge. But highlight coming all the way up to the edge. And then this guy having that burst. But again, making sure that the edge is in shadow. And then it's tapered in, right? Like this looks like a pretty harsh transition. So I need to taper that in. Blend it nicely. Some of this would be highlight. And then this little bulge would be casting some shadow. And if I need to make any of these pop, any of these shadows, I can brighten up the highlight, right? Like if I don't think it's enough, I can really make sure by adding more lines, still putting in that pin pressure, I can make sure that it's really going to be clear. So far I think you can see it though. Now as we come to this ridge in his head, right, if this is bumping in, it's bumping away from the light source, whereas this is bumping out back towards the light source. So we will add shadows and highlights accordingly. So then this would be catching just a bit until it rounds over that hump. Still catching here. Still catching, and now it's gonna taper, right? So through here it'll catch. Whereas on this one, right, we're gonna have some shadowing here. Now it you know, the face kind of runs into it, so it's not that there's an entire ridge down the face. I would say it's probably back to full highlight through here. And then we would need to transition and then, you know, up on this side, but it's just enough. And as I bring this back up, it should be just enough to indicate the bump. It's one thing to do it visually, but shadows and highlights are really where you're going to sell it. Coming from above and in front of, there probably is a little bit more pushing in. Make it look more like that. Alright, and then as his face comes over, I'll be going into shadow. I'll have to sort out exactly where that transition is taking place. And fixing the lines. So making sure the lines look straighter than they did. But also filling in some of this shadow. Tentacle is going to get its own highlight. Even though it's on the shadowed side, it's probably jutting forward, which means it likely is picking up some highlight. So we're going to give it just a little bit closer towards its top and tip, not all the way over because all edges are in shadow, and then fading that back off. Right, and it should give him just enough that it'll stand out. You know, just filling it in, straightening up the lines. This will be in shadow to really help sell the fact that his little duper's sticking forward. And the back side of this guy would be in shadow because he's also going to have a little burst of light. And just making sure he's nice and rounded. And we'll run into another. Alright, so he's going to have a little bit of light before popping back into shadow. And then all edges are in shadow, so let's get him situated. And then he's going to have some light as well. Now, I think I'm going to leave the top of this lip here in a little bit of shadow. I think that might help with the look of it going into like a mouth. I may change it if I decide that's not a good look. I often back out. You'll see me do that a lot. Because when you're close, you know, something can look good close and look bad from far away. And so I'll back out to get like the whole picture. How's it looking? Am I missing something? And I find that to be very important practice to kind of get into. Because if we're focused on just the one, we don't see how it's interacting with the whole. And so just filling in this gap now. All of this in highlight. In between the two that are in highlight. And then we'll start fading it out as we bring it over. And then I still have to get his eye over here done too. Well, and really that whole shadowed side. All I did was the edge. Alright, now I may just go ahead and start transitioning like I always do, where I find it easier to shadow something in and then sort out exactly where the transition would happen. It's probably going to be easier because it's going to happen right through here somewhere. So if I go ahead and start backing it off, I can really control when that happens. So again, this is just light pin pressure, really holding back, fewer strokes. Well, I should say the strokes aren't as thick, there might be more. But the more strokes you add, the brighter it'll become. Alright, now you can see here, right now, this is a pretty harsh transition. So we don't want that. That's why I did this, is it'll let me fade this in. And I don't need to put full pin pressure to fade this in. I'm just going to basically be putting moderate pin pressure and adding more lines. And that'll help blend in this sort of currently harsh transition from highlight to shadow. That's why I like to give myself extra space, because that really lets me blend in nice and easy. Now foreheads, same is true with inchworms. Foreheads are tend to have more light on them. If you think about how they're shaped, right? You have almost this ball. So light source coming from above and to the right, it's going to be casting that highlight a little further over towards the top where the forehead is. So, and there's not a lot of, you know, obstructions there. Our eyes or mouths are further down on most animals. Again, not putting full pin pressure, still very effective at fading this in. There we go. So now it has this nice fade, right? You can't see a very strong line, it just fades over into it. And now we just have his eye and mouth to go for the face, and then of course we have the rest of the body. Alright, we're going to give a little burst down here, right? I mean, it's under, so some of this is going to be in shadow, but we're going to give it a little burst of highlight as well. I'm going to do it in shadow and then sort that out. His little, I don't know what to call it, bottom lip, I guess. And it kind of goes into this little mouth. So just backing that way off. The amount of lines and the pin pressure and all of that's backing way off. And then giving a little bit of that burst right through here. And then we'll work on his eye, his other eye. A little bit more in shadow, right, than the other one because it's on that shadowed side, but doesn't mean we can't give it just a little bit of something. Not much, still keeping it in shadow, but sometimes I'll add a few lines in to make it just a smidge brighter than the areas around it. And I'm also making sure that this circle here is circular and not star-shaped, whatever it was. Okay. Alright, so there's its head. Now we have some of the other segments, right? So we'll bring this down and it's going to get some highlighting kind of right in the middle here. And likely that would actually be hitting into the head because there's a gap, right? Like the way the segment would be kind of coming down. Make sure that you have the shadow on the head, but the right segment's rounding forward. Oops. You know, with the light source coming from above and in front of, segment rounding forward, so the back side would go into shadow for sure. So that's rounding away from us. But the front side would be hitting highlight, and the head wouldn't be in a position to cast a shadow on it. Now, of course, underneath, that would have shadow. But above, not so much. Making sure that edge is nice and straight. Right, whenever something isn't clear, you can always brighten up a highlight around it, right? So I'm going to make sure that this is a clear line. That should give his face a clear edge. And then the same thing for the other one. So the edge, you know, against the first segment, going to be in that highlight. Even though that one's going into shadow, it'll create the line for us to delineate the space until it starts looping underneath. And then making sure this edge is, you know, again, nice and straight. And of course we have the legs. Same thing, all edges in shadow. Making sure the lines are nice and clean. And then giving it the highlight. Same thing on next leg, right? And then over, making sure it fixing any really errant lines. Which I have a few on this one. Making sure it's all nice and neat and makes sense. And then give it its little burst of highlight. Now the legs on the other side. First one might have a little bit of highlighting on it, but otherwise they're going to be in shadow. I'm backing that out because I came a little bit too far down with my brush strokes. Bringing that down. I'm going to do it all in shadow. This first leg first, and then I will add a little touch of highlight, making sure the line is straight, and then being careful around his head. It's not going to be a lot, and it's not going to be what's close to the body. If anything, it's going to be what's away from the body. Where the, because otherwise, right, close to the body, there's going to be, the body itself will be blocking, right, his head and body are blocking this leg from getting light. So anything that's going to happen is happening because the light source is just in front of, and you're past that point. But now the other two legs likely aren't going to benefit from that in any way. So they're just going to be in shadow. Just being careful, again, being careful by the head. A few strokes and you can kind of see some have. Going into it, it's fine. It's when they go too deep or, you know, put too much pin pressure or something else that I would fix it. That little bit is fine. Fixing these lines up here, there's some don't quite make sense. And then bringing it down. All right. Now we're going to start adding the highlights on these segments going up. Being mindful of where exactly we started tapering off the highlight against his face, right? So we need to be consistent all the way up. And again, all edges in shadow, right? So go ahead and get that shadow in on this first side. And make sure the lines are straightish. And then this back side, of course, is going to have a ton of shadow. And I would say that top of the segment should as well. And use that opportunity as I'm doing this to make sure that this is nice and straight, or, you know, it looks like a clean line even if it doesn't turn out to be completely straight. Some gentle slopes, or maybe more gentle than what I've already done. Right, I'm going to pull this up just a little bit because this came up so high. And now it needs to taper off. Still making that adjustment though. Line needs to be, doesn't have to 100% be in the right spot, but at least a little bit. Okay. Now, full pin pressure. So we bring it down and into the head, so we need to be careful against this side. It's almost harder as you have lines coming straight into another segment. You know, you just have to sort of be careful as you're drawing into it. Sometimes that's why I do it first, right? I draw very carefully on that edge. A few stray lines, again, won't make or break it. But I don't want anything too thick or heavy dipping into the head, so just being careful here. And then I can be a little looser as I fill in the rest of that, as I connect the two, basically. Now, in the process of this, I'm accidentally creating kind of a line, which I've seen that happen before, and the trick to that is to just brighten up the rest of it, right? Like if I brighten this up, that line will go away. It's happening because there's a strong highlight overlap. And now it's gone. Bringing the shadow over because, you know, just like the face, want control over exactly where I'm sort of cutting highlight into shadow and dipping into pushing the shadow further than I know it goes to give me the flexibility to make a smooth transition and make sure it lines up with what I've already done, right? So some transition happening right through here, strong full pin pressure into not full pin pressure and more lines. So that's about where it would need to start shifting over. Now to transition that shadow, you know, just like before, it's not full pin pressure, I'm just adding more lines. And now I'm going to blend in this right up here. I feel like that is a bit of a harsh transition. We need to do that. Oh, words didn't quite come out there. And we need to do that for, you know, the rest of these going up. Same thing. Get the edges set. Make sure everything is nice and smooth. Get this, you know, backside shadowed. And then full pin pressure as we get the rest of this in and connect it back. Just like we did with the other one, being careful on that edge. I find that if I have trouble getting that line right, I can zoom in. Getting that edge in makes the rest of this nice and easy, right? Like I can just come in here and put full pin pressure, and I have that wiggle room. And then to fix it, as we've talked about, right, because there's that little bit of sometimes of a line that shows up, you just brighten up where it's connecting in. All right, and now to feather that in. And again, you know, not full pin pressure. Just lightly bringing it over. Right, and almost. So one of the reasons I back out, right, is from way back here I can see it doesn't quite work with the hole. So by backing out, I can feather that in better than I would have. And there's still some gaps right in here, but nothing major. And then we have two more before we change the pattern. These should be a bit easier down the back side, because you don't have really any spot, right, where it's running straight down into another one. Even this loop here isn't really straight into it, whereas these are straight down into it. So these are still going to be a little tricky, and this one a bit, but only down in here, maybe a little bit on the edge, but the back half of the inchworm should be a bit easier than the front half. So it'll be smooth sailing after we get this in. But sometimes, as I'm sure you know, you've seen, I find it easier to get the treble spots in first. Those areas that are a little trickier, require a little bit more delicate pen usage, and then, you know, build from there. And again, as I'm doing this, making sure to straighten out the lines. Fix any weird gaps or bulges that might have been there. Alright, and now to feather it in, although I just realized this seems a bit darker than it should be on this little segment. Alright. And making sure I get up with this one as well, and then feathering it in. Need to back out, make sure they all make sense and line up with each other, so I'm going to pull this, like I think it's feathered in, but right, this one comes over a little bit more, and so I'm going to pull this one over a little bit more. I want that transitioning at the same point. Ish. Close enough. Especially because these two segments are so similar. What's nice about it is because it does have segments, there is a little bit of a natural, like, pulling back point, right? Like I can pull back and analyze, see if I've got something right or wrong, instead of doing a whole, like, half of a face or something. Those segments create sort of a natural stopping point. And it's not that hard to line up shadows and highlights, as long as, you know, as long as you're looking for it, but you should look for it. on something like this. Sometimes I see it if you separate, depends on how you draw like an elephant's trunk or something, would have the same idea, right? You want to make sure in all of the wrinkly skin, if you decide to do that separately, which it's a little harder to do, so I would recommend you get a lot of detail if you do it separately, but you can also do the trunk all as one and sort of build in details on top of that. But you know, the trunk would be a good example where if you're drawing each segment out separately, you want to make sure that highlight and shadow are hitting at the same point all the way down the trunk. It's a little easier with an inchworm though, because their segments are so much bigger, whereas an elephant's trunk is so small. It takes a while to potentially do all of that if you're drawing it out by segments. I've done that before. I don't know that I would do it like that again. I think the elephant I did on here, I did the whole thing and then added the details of the wrinkles on top of that. A lot of good details though. You don't want the wrinkling on the elephant creates a lot of good like you know, detail there. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to include. And they have wrinkling all over. You know, their faces, their trunks, their ears. A lot of good chances to put tons of detail in with elephants. Alright, and now to feather that in. Feather a little bit up here too. Don't want a hard transition anywhere. As I bring it further and further over, I'm putting less strokes and less pin pressure, right? That's how I'm feathering it out. Make sure that it is all nice and lined up and adding where I need to. Now, over here, right, we have an edge as it folds up, and it loops over. And then here we have the edge as it comes down. Now, with the light source coming above and in front of, you know, we don't have enough yet blocking this recess as it comes down to cast a shadow. So this is going to be full pin pressure as it comes under here. You know, edges in shadow, which is why this edge is in shadow. But so is this back edge, and then all of that leading up to it on this back side would be in highlight. So once we get past this point, gonna build in that pin pressure. And there we go. Got this little back going. Now we're gonna just finish out this edge, make sure the edge is nice and smooth as we add in that shadow. It helps because we loop this down, so that makes that a little easier to fix any of the edges. And then we'd be going right into highlight. I'm still building in this back side. Alright, I'm building in the highlight. And carefully blending that in, and then we'll blend that in as we come over here. Alright, now to feather that in. It needs some feathering over here too. There we go. Alright, now to start bringing that down. This edge will be in shadow, but the rest of it won't be, right? For the same reason but this interior one wasn't. Nothing's really blocking this yet. Not enough. So I'm just going to make sure that all these edges are straight. The little segments have a little bit of a ridge. Well, and there's some bowing that happens within the animal as well, so even though this is running into more of itself, there would still be a ridge there. Now these last few back here, you know, underneath will be in shadow, so I'll have to sort that out. And then of course this edge is also in shadow, as is this interior edge. I didn't do a good job on that line. And that's in shadow because it's an edge, right? You know, you have the edge of the foot. And it's just full pin pressure. I know on the sections, the segments coming up, we had to worry about where that light was transitioning, but because, you know, it's only this one side, we don't have to do that because it's just that sliver. The rest of it's in highlight, but with the highlight butting up to the shadow, it really makes a noticeable transition, right? You can see it when I pull back. How easy it is to see the front versus the back, and you can kind of see that ridge. It's because of this shadow on the edge and the highlight on the other side. It's looking pretty good. Now we have this little ruffled foot, so edge is still in shadow. That edge, all I'm doing is kind of like this sort of drawing, right? Like I'm just kind of going back and forth, small, light strokes here to give it the impression that it's got a little ruffled edge. And then I'll add a little bit of highlight to it. It's just not got a lot of space, so it's going to be easier just to do this little bit in shadow. And then make sure I'm adding the highlight where, you know, it makes sense to what I've done. So add like little bits doing the same thing. The quick way to add texture is just doing these strokes. Now I am putting full pin pressure and then back off once I get to those edges. So now his little ruffled foot has some texture. Alright, and then there's going to be an edge here. And I just need to see it. An edge here. Making sure the edge is deep enough. Doesn't have to be a ton. And then underneath is in shadow, so making sure that that shadow, that underneath the line is even, and that the shadow is the same across all three of these little segments here. But there's a change that happens there. Just that little bit of an edge. And then the bottom in shadow. And then this last one too. Making sure the edge is straight. Oh, not doing a very good job though, am I? Can be close without having to be perfect. Sometimes little jagged edges come up and that's okay. Alright, now it's a little back spot into the foot. Which this foot is shaped differently. Alright, now to feather this in. Right, just like before, I'm not using full pin pressure. Just need to make sure this isn't a harsh line. And then the same up here. Now, same for this one. Alright, just blending it a little bit more. And up here as well. And then we have the last little leg. Now I did add shadow to the foot, however, it occurred to me after I did that the foot isn't really rounding under. I mean, you know, part of it is certainly you have like a little loop coming under, and I'm going to say that this is probably rounding a little bit under. But it's going to be gripping out, which means this is still going to be a bit of a shadow further down. I mean, a highlight. One of those things. Feather that in. And up here, I accidentally have the highlight coming up a little much. Alright, so now that he's mostly drawn in, we're going to give his eyes a little burst of brown. And then probably add a few little wispy bits of hair to him. Not much, not very saturated, just kind of in this little eye spot. Alright, now they don't have much hair. It's just like a few random like pieces coming off. This is just light pin pressure. And on the actual leg instead of in space here. Putting a little bit extra pin pressure in the middle where it's harder to see. But otherwise just very light. Alright, so that is how you draw an inchworm. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.